You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the journalist and author Rachel Shabi and the leader writer for the Daily Telegraph, Tim Stanley. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The Sunday Times reveals the end of free lateral flow tests as Boris Johnson is set to announce a strategy of living with COVID within weeks. The Observer quotes a former head of the UK vaccine task force who believes that once the booster campaign is over, mass jabs for COVID should end and the virus should be treated as an endemic similar to the flu. Scotland's Sunday Mail reports that in an attempt to lessen pressure on the NHS, the government there is considering paying people who care for their elderly relatives as much as £15 an hour. The Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, writes for the Sunday Telegraph, insisting that if an agreement can't be reached with the EU, she'll invoke Article 16 of the post-Brexit Northern Ireland protocols with a review to resolving the matter sensitively. According to the Sunday Express, the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, is calling on the House of Lords not to soften new police powers, which she believes would give greater comfort to the families of knife crime victims. The Sunday Mirror, here's Danny Dyer, will soon leave his long-time role on EastEnders. And The Star has a story concerning the celebrity spoon bender, Uri Geller. Intriguing. And we're joined tonight by Rachel Shabi and Tim Stanley. Welcome to you both. Let's start with the Times and that story that we mentioned at the beginning of the paper's run-through. Potential end to free lateral flow tests, something that the government, according to the article, might be looking at. Tim?
This feels like a significant moment in the pandemic. It represents the government shifting gears from treating this as a pandemic that you throw everything at, back to acting as though it's endemic. It's a dreadful disease. It's one you want to limit people's exposure to, but essentially people have got to get on with living, and they've got to live around the disease and treat it more like seasonal flu. That kind of action seems to be supported by the relatively mild nature of Omicron. Though having said that, of course, there's still a lot of pressure on hospitals. The Times also quotes Nadhim Zahawi, the Education Secretary, saying that he would like to see the number of days spent in isolation cut from 7 to 5. This is also significant. Why? Because, again, it feeds into the change in the nature of the problem we face. This time last year, the central problem with COVID was that it was a horrible disease that was putting people into intensive care. It's still doing that, but the bigger problem with the NHS isn't so much the direct consequence of the disease and what it does to the patient, as it is the number of staff having to take time off. And I know there are other issues like underfunding, which I'm sure we can get into, but that is the central problem, is people actually taking time off work because they've got the disease. So what Zahawi's saying there, you need to cut the number of days in isolation from 7 to 5, gives us some hint of what really is, of the change in the nature of the concern with the government and the change in its focus, away from stopping the transmission of the disease and towards instead persuading the public to come to terms with the disease and to live with it.
Yes, and it's quoting a senior Whitehall source saying, "I don't think we're in a world where we can continue to hand out free lateral flow tests to everybody. It's likely we will move to a scenario where there is less testing, but we have a capacity to ramp it up if necessary." And according to the article, it's worth saying that what they're saying here is the new system could mean free tests being provided only to high-risk settings, such as care homes, hospitals and schools. Rachel?
Yes, this is an announcement coming from the government on the very same day that we, the UK, have now passed 150,000 deaths from COVID, which I know that, Sky has been reporting on throughout the day. And obviously, my heart goes out to anyone who's lost a loved one because of this terrible disease. And when you hear people who have lost loved ones talk, one of the things they say is that they don't wish this upon anyone else. And of course, none of us do. So with that in mind, what actually is the government doing with this? It's not going to help us live with COVID if it starts to charge people for lateral flow tests. All that will do is mean that the disparities, the economic disparities that along which the disease has ravaged this country will be exacerbated, because people who can't afford to buy a test won't buy a test. So that, let's be clear that that's what this policy will do. It will just mean that people can't afford to have tests. And let's bear in mind that in the last few weeks, this has been the way that people have been able to, live with the virus, if indeed that, if that's the government's stated objective. People have been able to have lateral flow tests before they go out, before they meet loved ones, before kids go to school. There are so many contexts in which having regular free lateral flow tests is actually vital to allowing us to get on with our lives. So this announcement is just baffling. It just seems so wrong-headed and so short-sighted. It's obviously going to cost far, far more in the long term.
Just want to read you a government response to that story that we've just got in, saying that everyone can continue to get free tests, and we are continuing to encourage people to use rapid tests when they need them. Record numbers of tests are being delivered to pharmacies, homes and those who need them. The UK's testing programme is the biggest in Europe, with over 400 million PCR and LFD tests carried out since the start of the pandemic. Testing continues to play an important role in helping people live their day-to-day lives, keep businesses running and keep young people in school. So although the article is suggesting that there will be an end to free tests, it by no means is something that's been decided as of now, Tim.
No, that's correct. And also, just to pick up on what Rachel just said about the costs, I think that's a very good point. Over the course of the Christmas holiday, I probably took between 10 or 12 of these tests in order to make sure that I could safely go and see people and I could safely go to work. So it started to become factored into people's behaviour. The free lateral tests are a way that many people have found a way of living with the virus. And if you then have to charge for them, then obviously people are going to make different kind of decision. But that leads us on to a subtle psychological change in the British people's attitudes towards COVID. If the test in the future is no longer free, the implication is that the government doesn't think COVID is that great a risk to that great a number of people, that it doesn't have to give them free testing to ensure that they can safely go around without transmitting it to everyone. Which leads us on to the story, I believe, on the front cover of The Guardian, which quotes the former head of the vaccine task force, Dr. Clive Dix, saying we
it's
also
The
need to
Observer.
The Observer.
Yes.
My apologies. We need to stop. This cycle of vaccination programs, and that we need to come to terms with the disease, treat it like we would other ones, and not constantly be vaccinating people against it. Again, this is about setting the British people up with coming to terms with life in a world in which COVID is one of a number of diseases which threatens us, and in which, by the way, the problems that we face in tackling it return us to long-term issues about underfunding in the NHS and the number of doctors, because that's the structural reason right now why we're struggling with this Omicron wave. It's absences at work, but it's also a consequence of 10 years or so of underfunding and of a decline in the number of doctors per patient, and a comparatively low number of intensive care beds compared to many countries on the continent. So it's all this is pointing us towards the beginning of a change in cultural attitudes towards COVID.
And Rachel, the article quoting Dr. Clive Dix saying that we need to return to a new normality, and eventually COVID is going to have to be treated like the flu.
Well, you know what? I think that probably sounds right about, jab number 4. I do think that in a global sense, it makes no sense whatsoever for some countries to race ahead with boosters while other countries in the world still don't even have access to vaccine 1. And in terms of producing more variants globally, that's creating more likelihood of that. I would like to say one thing about Omicron is that it's slightly deceptive, I believe, in that it is, the research is showing that it is milder and it's not affecting lungs in the same way. However, it is so much more transmissible that you end up with just as many people hospitalized because the infection rates are so much higher. So actually, there are hospitals across England, outside of London, where they are seeing numbers of patients in with COVID at similar numbers to the peak of January 21. And bear in mind that we haven't reached our peak yet. We're probably 10 days or 2 weeks away from that. So I don't think we're at that stage yet where it's not a very serious and life-threatening disease. That obviously we are heading in that direction, but I don't think we're there yet. And we also need to decide whether we're happy for the NHS to live with that situation, with 25 NHS trusts declaring an emergency, a critical incident, with staff falling out of the NHS. Last year, apparently recorded record numbers left the NHS. Is it acceptable to put NHS and other health workers under this level of stress and trauma? I don't think we should be living with that.
Rachel?
Well, we have no choice. We have no choice. And this is why the government's exploring this calculation about the number of days that people take off in isolation. Accepting that argument, which is entirely correct. We do have a choice,
Tim. That's an absurd thing to say. We do have a choice.
Well, what else are we supposed to do in the next month or so to fix that problem, other than making sure that more NHS staff can go back to work? We're not going to transform the NHS in the next month. We just have to get over this hump. And that's why I'm saying the government is exploring this calculation of reducing the number of time people are in isolation so that staff can go back to work.
You're right to say, first of all, you were right to identify 10 years of Conservative government underfunding of the NHS as leading us to this problem. But one of the first things the government could do right now is make sure that all NHS staff have adequate PPE. At the moment, they're not given even properly ventilating masks or properly filtrating masks. So even something like that would make a huge difference. The government just isn't interested.
Thank you both. We are going to take a break. Don't worry, we're coming back, Tim. Thanks very much for the moment. Coming up, Number 10 offers no comment as the Prime Minister is once again accused of attending a social gathering during the first lockdown. We'll discuss that next. You're watching the press preview. Still with me, Rachel Shabi and Tim Stanley. There they are. Welcome back. Now, I have to say I've been educated by this next item in the Sunday Times, a story involving the Prime Minister and a BEOB, which I had no idea what that stood for. Rachel, educate us all and tell us about the story.
I feel like it's almost like showing your age when you know what BEOB means. Bring your own bottle to a party or indeed a restaurant where you're allowed to bring your own bottle of alcohol. But in this case, it's an invite to a party at Downing Street, which some 40 people were thought to have attended, including, it transpires, Boris Johnson. So he didn't join other Christmas parties that were organised. This is looking at 2020, and this party was believed to have been held on May the 20th. But he is, according to this report in the Times, thought to have been at this one. Of course, Downing Street denies pretty much everything about this story.
Yes, and this at a time when restrictions were in place. And this is the allegation, I think, laid by Dominic Cummings, that this is 5 days after the pictures of that first, Downing Street, say, working meeting that we saw people in the back garden of Downing Street. But this is another party which invitations were sent out on May the 20th. Happened on May the 20th, Tim.
That's correct. I'd love to attend more work meetings where you're invited to bring your own bottle. It's always seemed to me that if you vote Brexit, you turn into the French. That seems like a very continental way of doing work. But it feels it's very embarrassing. Obviously, it taps into the wider questions around the wallpapering and redecorating of the Prime Minister's flat, which just means the Prime Minister begins the year still fending off allegations. The interesting question, one interesting question about some of the stuff related to socialising at Downing Street is where all this stuff is coming from. Who is leaking it? Whose interest is it to do it? Who produced that photograph? No one's quite sure, but still the stories are coming.
Yes, interesting. And that email is going to be key evidence in a sleaze inquiry being run by Whitehall enforcer Sue Gray. Thank you very much, both, for the moment.